How and why avoidants fault find. It rarely begins with one devastating argument. Instead, it often starts with something so small that you almost laugh it off. Suddenly, the way you text is a problem. The way you laugh is a little too loud. The questions you ask are somehow too much. The things they once called adorable become annoying. The habits they once smiled at become evidence that you're somehow doing the relationship wrong. If you've ever experienced that unsettling shift, you probably found yourself asking the same painful question over and over again. What changed? It's one of the most confusing experiences in relationships because it can feel as though the rules quietly changed without anyone telling you. The person who once seemed grateful for your presence now appears to notice only your imperfections. Today we're exploring why that pattern can sometimes emerge in relationships, what psychology can teach us about it, and why it doesn't automatically mean there was something fundamentally wrong with you. Stay with me until the end, because one insight near the end of this video may completely change the way you interpret everything you've been blaming yourself for. And if these conversations help you untangle relationship patterns that once felt impossible to understand, take a second to subscribe. Your future self might appreciate having a place that reminds you not to confuse someone's changing perception with your unchanging worth. One of the most fascinating things about the beginning of a relationship is how naturally attention gravitates toward possibility. During those early weeks and months, people are often discovering one another through curiosity instead of familiarity. Every conversation feels new. Every shared experience adds another piece to an exciting picture that is still being formed. In that stage, strengths naturally stand out because the mind is actively searching for reasons to connect. The quirks that might later become ordinary often feel charming. The differences between two people seem refreshing rather than frustrating. Psychologists sometimes describe this as a period where positive impressions carry significant emotional weight. That doesn't mean people are pretending or ignoring reality. It simply means our attention is influenced by excitement, hope, and the anticipation of building something meaningful. Over time, however, familiarity changes perception. As daily routines replace novelty, the brain stops focusing so intensely on what is exciting and begins paying greater attention to what feels unresolved, stressful, or uncertain. This shift isn't unique to romantic relationships. It happens in friendships, careers, and countless areas of life. The challenge is that when emotional tension begins entering the relationship, those changing patterns of attention can dramatically alter how partners see one another. As emotional closeness deepens, relationships naturally ask more of both people. Conversations become more vulnerable. Expectations become clearer. The future begins feeling less theoretical and more real. For many couples, this stage strengthens intimacy because trust grows alongside openness. For others, however, greater closeness can also bring greater emotional discomfort. People respond to intimacy differently based on personality, past experiences, emotional habits, and many other factors. Some feel increasingly secure as connection grows, while others may begin experiencing internal tension that is difficult to explain. It isn't necessarily that love disappears. Rather, the emotional demands of maintaining closeness can begin feeling heavier than they once did. When that happens, subtle changes in perception sometimes follow. Behaviors that once seemed harmless may suddenly feel irritating. Conversations that once felt comforting may begin feeling emotionally draining. Again, this doesn't happen in every relationship, nor should it be viewed as an inevitable pattern. But when someone is struggling with the emotional experience of increasing intimacy, their attention may gradually shift away from what originally attracted them and toward what now feels difficult. The relationship hasn't necessarily changed overnight. The way it is being experienced has. This is where fault-finding can quietly enter the picture. It often isn't announced with dramatic declarations or obvious hostility. Instead, it grows through accumulated observations that gradually become more negative. A forgotten errand becomes evidence that you're unreliable. A misunderstood comment becomes proof that you never listen. A difference in communication style becomes a sign that you're incompatible. Under emotional stress, the human mind naturally pays closer attention to information that appears to support whatever conclusion it is already beginning to reach. This tendency, sometimes called confirmation bias, is not limited to romantic relationships or any particular attachment pattern. It's a common feature of human thinking. Once someone's attention becomes focused on problems, the brain often begins collecting additional examples that reinforce that perspective. Slowly, isolated frustrations start connecting into a larger narrative. Instead of seeing occasional imperfections within a caring relationship, someone may begin seeing the relationship itself through the lens of those imperfections. This shift can feel incredibly confusing for the receiving partner because they haven't fundamentally changed. They're often the same person they were months earlier, yet somehow they now seem to be evaluated through an entirely different filter. That changing filter also explains why the smallest things can suddenly feel much bigger than they objectively are. Habits that barely registered before now receive repeated attention. Tiny disagreements become symbolic of larger concerns. Everyday imperfections begin carrying emotional meaning far beyond their actual significance. From the outside, it can feel as though you're constantly trying to solve problems that multiply faster than you can address them. You fix one concern only to discover another waiting in its place. You become more careful with your words, more thoughtful with your actions, more willing to compromise, yet the sense of being evaluated never fully disappears. Over time, this experience can quietly reshape the way you see yourself. Instead of asking whether the relationship is healthy for both people, you begin wondering whether you are simply not enough. You replay conversations searching for mistakes. You question parts of your personality that once felt completely natural. You start believing that if you could just become a little more patient, a little more understanding, or a little less emotional, everything might finally return to how it used to be. But relationships rarely become healthier through one person endlessly trying to eliminate every perceived flaw. When acceptance depends on perfection, perfection never actually arrives. And that's why understanding the psychology behind changing perceptions is so important. Not to assign blame, but to recognize that another person's growing focus on faults does not automatically define your value, your character, or your capacity to be deeply loved. Once that pattern of focusing on flaws becomes established, another psychological process can quietly strengthen it. Human beings naturally seek consistency between their thoughts, emotions, and decisions. When someone begins feeling uncertain about a relationship, the mind often starts searching for evidence that explains those emotions. This isn't unique to romantic relationships, nor is it limited to any one attachment style. It's a broader human tendency to create a story that makes our internal experiences feel coherent. If someone is already emotionally leaning toward creating more distance, they may begin paying closer attention to moments that seem to justify that direction. Suddenly, forgotten disappointments are remembered more vividly than joyful experiences. Minor disagreements begin feeling like proof of deeper incompatibility. Small frustrations, once dismissed as ordinary imperfections, start appearing like warning signs that should have been noticed all along. The relationship itself hasn't necessarily transformed overnight, but the lens through which it is being viewed has. Once that lens becomes dominant, it can feel as though every new interaction simply confirms what the mind has already started believing. This is one reason fault-finding can seem to grow so quickly. It's often less about discovering entirely new problems and more about assigning greater emotional significance to problems that previously carried very little weight. For the person on the receiving end, however, the experience can become emotionally exhausting in ways that are difficult to explain to anyone who hasn't lived through it. Every conversation begins carrying an invisible pressure. Before speaking, you wonder whether your words will somehow be misunderstood. Before making plans, you worry that you'll choose the wrong option. Before expressing your feelings, you hesitate because you're unsure whether vulnerability will be welcomed or criticized. Gradually, your attention shifts away from simply enjoying the relationship and toward avoiding mistakes. You become hyper-aware of your behavior, constantly scanning for anything that might trigger another complaint. It feels like walking through a room filled with fragile glass where every step requires careful calculation. Ironically, that constant self-monitoring often creates even more anxiety, making communication less natural and more guarded. Instead of feeling accepted for who you are, you begin feeling evaluated for who you're failing to become. Over time, this can quietly erode confidence because no matter how much effort you invest, the finish line keeps moving. Each adjustment brings temporary relief before another perceived flaw takes its place. Eventually, the relationship begins revolving around avoiding criticism rather than building connection, and that's a painful place for any partnership to exist. This is also why defending yourself repeatedly often fails to produce the outcome you hope for. Your instinct is understandable. When someone points out something that feels unfair or inaccurate, it's natural to explain your perspective, clarify your intentions, or correct misunderstandings. Healthy relationships absolutely benefit from honest communication, mutual listening, and respectful disagreement. But when a relationship has shifted into a pattern where one person consistently interprets events through an increasingly negative filter, explanations alone may not resolve the deeper issue. Every defense can unintentionally become another topic to debate. Every clarification can be interpreted as avoidance of responsibility. Conversations that begin with one disagreement gradually expand into discussions about past arguments, personality traits, and entirely different issues. Before long, neither person is talking about the original concern anymore. Instead, both are trying to prove that their overall perception of the relationship is correct. This emotional polarization makes compromise increasingly difficult because the conversation stops being about solving one problem and starts becoming about validating two very different realities. The more each person tries to convince the other, the further apart they can begin to feel. Living inside that environment for an extended period changes something far deeper than daily communication. It begins reshaping the way you see yourself. Confidence is rarely lost all at once. More often, it disappears through hundreds of tiny moments that quietly accumulate. You stop trusting your instincts because they've been questioned so frequently. You apologize for things that aren't actually your responsibility because conflict has taught you that apologizing sometimes feels easier than defending yourself. You second-guess harmless decisions because you've grown accustomed to expecting criticism. Perhaps the most painful part is that you gradually forget what it feels like to relax inside a relationship. Instead of experiencing love as a place where you can be fully known, it becomes a place where you're constantly trying to pass an invisible test. And invisible tests are impossible to pass because the grading criteria are never clearly defined. This emotional exhaustion doesn't always appear dramatically. It often reveals itself quietly through sleepless nights, persistent self-doubt, or the strange feeling that you've somehow become a smaller version of the person you used to be. That's why prolonged criticism can have such a lasting impact. It doesn't simply affect your view of the relationship. It slowly begins affecting your relationship with yourself. Yet even in the middle of that exhaustion, an important truth remains easy to overlook. No amount of perfect behavior can guarantee lasting acceptance from another human being. Every relationship requires accountability, compromise, and a willingness to grow, but healthy growth emerges from mutual respect, not from one person constantly attempting to earn basic kindness. Love was never meant to feel like a permanent performance review. It was never designed to require flawless execution before warmth, patience, or understanding could be offered. The moment you begin believing that peace depends entirely on eliminating every perceived imperfection, you've accepted a burden that no person can realistically carry. Real intimacy doesn't grow because two people stop making mistakes. It grows because both people feel emotionally safe enough to acknowledge those mistakes without turning them into permanent definitions of one another. And perhaps that realization becomes the first step toward reclaiming something that prolonged fault-finding often quietly steals: the ability to trust your own heart, your own character, and your own inherent worth, even when someone else's perception has changed. Eventually, every relationship reaches a moment where the conversations stop, the constant explanations fade, the debates lose their urgency, and the emotional noise that once filled every day is replaced by an unfamiliar silence. At first, that silence can feel unsettling because you've become so accustomed to defending yourself that the absence of criticism almost feels unnatural. You wake up expecting another difficult conversation that never comes. You catch yourself mentally preparing responses to arguments that no longer exist. It's surprising how long the body remembers patterns even after the relationship has ended. Healing rarely begins the moment the breakup happens. Often it begins the moment your nervous system slowly realizes it no longer has to stay on high alert. That doesn't erase grief. It doesn't erase love, disappointment, or the dreams that disappeared alongside the relationship. But it does create something that constant conflict never could: space. Space to think without reacting. Space to remember the relationship in its entirety instead of through the lens of the latest disagreement. Space to ask difficult questions, not only about what happened between the two of you, but about what happened to you while you were trying so hard to keep everything together. Sometimes that distance reveals painful truths. Sometimes it reveals compassionate ones. Either way, perspective often grows more balanced once emotional survival is no longer the day's primary task. With enough time, many people begin looking back differently. During the relationship, every criticism may have felt like undeniable proof that you were failing. You accepted comments about your personality, your communication, or your habits because they were repeated often enough that they started sounding like facts instead of opinions. But distance has an extraordinary ability to separate emotion from interpretation. Memories that once carried overwhelming guilt begin revealing greater complexity. You remember not only the moments where you made mistakes, but also the countless times you showed patience, offered support, apologized sincerely, and tried to understand perspectives different from your own. You begin realizing that you were never a flawless partner, but neither was anyone else. More importantly, you recognize that being imperfect was never the true problem. Healthy relationships expect imperfection. They create room for growth without turning every weakness into a permanent character judgment. Looking back with greater clarity doesn't mean rewriting history to make yourself the hero or someone else the villain. It means allowing the full picture to emerge instead of only the version shaped by conflict. That fuller picture often restores something invaluable, your ability to trust your own memories instead of automatically dismissing them whenever they contradict someone else's perception. There is, however, one temptation that quietly delays healing for countless people. It is the hope that one day the other person will return and finally admit they were wrong. You imagine hearing the words you've been waiting for. You picture them acknowledging your efforts, apologizing for the constant criticism, and recognizing the love they struggled to appreciate. It's an understandable fantasy because validation feels like it would settle every unanswered question. Yet placing your healing entirely in the hands of someone else's future realization creates another invisible prison. Your emotional freedom becomes dependent on an event you cannot predict or control. Days become months, months become years, and your life remains emotionally paused while you wait for a conversation that may never happen. Even if that conversation eventually arrives, it cannot undo the time spent doubting yourself. Closure is powerful when it comes, but lasting healing cannot rely on it. The moment you stop requiring another person's agreement in order to believe your own experience is the moment your confidence begins returning. You no longer need unanimous approval to accept that your feelings mattered, that your efforts were real, and that your version of the relationship deserves space alongside anyone else's. That growing confidence doesn't arrive through dramatic declarations. It returns quietly, almost unnoticed at first. You begin making decisions without asking yourself how someone else would judge them. You laugh more freely because you're no longer monitoring every word before it leaves your mouth. You rediscover opinions that had slowly disappeared beneath the weight of constant compromise. You reconnect with friends who remind you of who you were before you started questioning every part of yourself. Most importantly, you begin trusting your emotional instincts again. For a long time, criticism may have convinced you that your perceptions were unreliable, that your needs were excessive, or that your reactions were always the problem. But rebuilding self-trust means recognizing that your emotions carry information, not final verdicts. Feeling hurt doesn't automatically mean someone intended to hurt you, but neither does it mean your pain should be dismissed. Feeling unseen doesn't automatically prove someone didn't care, but it also doesn't require you to endlessly ignore your own experience. Emotional maturity isn't about distrusting your feelings, it's about listening to them with honesty while allowing wisdom, compassion, and perspective to guide your responses. As that inner foundation becomes stronger, boundaries begin taking on an entirely new meaning. Many people mistakenly believe boundaries are walls built to keep others away, but healthy boundaries are actually invitations to healthier relationships. They communicate where respect ends and self-abandonment begins. They remind you that compassion should never require tolerating patterns that consistently diminish your emotional well-being. Loving someone deeply does not obligate you to accept endless criticism in exchange for occasional affection. Understanding another person's struggles does not mean sacrificing your own emotional health indefinitely. Healthy boundaries allow you to remain kind without becoming responsible for fixing everything. They allow you to remain open without becoming unprotected. Perhaps most importantly, they create space for relationships where acceptance is not earned through perfection, but offered alongside imperfection. Because in the healthiest relationships, love doesn't constantly ask, how can you become less difficult to love? Instead, it gently asks, how can we grow together while continuing to respect the humanity we both already possess? That question changes everything, because it shifts the goal from proving your worth to protecting it, and that may be one of the most important lessons any difficult relationship can leave behind. Once you've rebuilt that foundation, another question naturally begins to surface. Can patterns of persistent fault-finding actually change? The answer is neither as hopeless nor as simple as many people want it to be. Human beings are capable of extraordinary growth, but growth is never automatic. It requires self-awareness, honest reflection, and a willingness to examine uncomfortable truths without immediately defending them. Relationship dynamics are created by two unique people, each bringing their own history, habits, fears, strengths, and blind spots into the connection. When someone begins recognizing that constant criticism has become a barrier to intimacy rather than a solution to it, meaningful change becomes possible. That recognition may come through personal reflection, counseling, difficult conversations, or experiences that challenge long-held assumptions. But recognizing a pattern is only the beginning. Lasting change happens through consistent practice. It is expressed in learning to communicate concerns without attacking character, in replacing assumptions with curiosity, and in becoming willing to tolerate the natural imperfections that every close relationship inevitably contains. Without that willingness, even the strongest desire to improve often fades back into familiar habits. This is why hope should always be connected to observable growth rather than wishful thinking alone. Believing people can change is healthy. Pretending they already have when nothing has truly shifted is not. As your understanding deepens, you also begin redefining what a healthy relationship is supposed to feel like. For a long time, you may have mistaken emotional uncertainty for passion, because the highs felt incredibly high after surviving so many lows. Relief after conflict may have felt like intimacy. Temporary peace may have felt like proof that everything was finally getting better. But healthy love usually feels far less dramatic than people expect. It doesn't require you to rehearse every sentence before speaking. It doesn't leave you wondering whether today's version of yourself will still be acceptable tomorrow. In a healthy relationship, disagreements are not treated as evidence that one person is fundamentally flawed. They become opportunities to understand each other more deeply. Constructive feedback exists, but it is offered with respect rather than contempt. Differences are discussed without turning them into permanent labels. Both people remain accountable for their actions while also extending grace to one another's humanity. Emotional safety doesn't mean there are no difficult conversations. It means those conversations take place within an atmosphere where both people know they are valued even when they disagree. That quiet sense of security is often unfamiliar to someone who has spent years believing love must constantly be earned. Looking back, many people eventually discover that the greatest lesson arrived much later than they expected. They realize that love alone cannot carry a relationship if appreciation slowly disappears beneath constant evaluation. Admiration needs to be nurtured just as intentionally as communication. Respect must remain present even during frustration. Every long-term partnership will reveal imperfections because perfection was never part of the agreement. The question is whether those imperfections become invitations for teamwork or ammunition for criticism. Relationships thrive when both people remember that they are on the same side of the problem rather than treating each other as the problem itself. That shift may sound simple, but it changes everything. Instead of keeping score, partners begin offering support. Instead of searching for evidence that the other person is failing, they begin looking for ways to strengthen the connection they both care about. No relationship achieves this perfectly every day, but healthy ones consistently return to that mindset after conflict. The goal is not to eliminate every disagreement. The goal is to protect the relationship while working through those disagreements together. Perhaps one of the most liberating moments in healing comes when you finally stop trying to become impossible to criticize. For so long, you may have believed that if you could just be more patient, more understanding, more flexible, more cheerful, more independent, more affectionate, or somehow perfectly balanced in every situation, everything would finally fall into place. But perfection is a destination that constantly moves farther away each time you approach it. There will always be another standard to meet if your value depends entirely on someone else's shifting expectations. The freedom arrives when you realize that authenticity is infinitely healthier than endless performance. You no longer shape every decision around avoiding disapproval. You allow yourself to have preferences, opinions, emotions, and boundaries without immediately apologizing for them. You understand that maturity includes taking responsibility for genuine mistakes while refusing to accept blame for simply being human. Ironically, this authenticity often creates stronger relationships because it invites honesty instead of performance. Real connection grows between two imperfect people who feel safe enough to be genuine, not between two actors endlessly trying to maintain flawless roles. So if there is one truth to carry with you after everything we've explored today, let it be this. You were never meant to earn basic acceptance through perfect behavior. Healthy love has room for forgotten errands, misunderstood conversations, difficult seasons, changing emotions, and ordinary human mistakes. It doesn't require one person to spend years proving they deserve kindness before receiving it. It doesn't measure your worth by how few flaws someone can find. Instead, it recognizes that every meaningful relationship is built between two beautifully imperfect people, learning, growing, apologizing, forgiving, and choosing each other again and again. If you've spent months or even years believing someone else's criticism was the final word on your value, allow today to become the moment that story begins changing. Let your future relationships be guided not by the fear of making mistakes, but by the confidence that genuine love can survive them. Because the right relationship will never ask you to erase your humanity before it offers respect. It will meet your humanity with compassion, your imperfections with grace, and your heart with the same acceptance you've spent so long trying to give everyone else. And once you experience that kind of love, you'll never again confuse constant fault-finding with genuine intimacy, because you'll finally understand that real love doesn't keep searching for reasons to pull away. It keeps searching for ways to grow closer together.